Alright guys, so in today's video we're going to be discussing the John Deere 420 and 430 tractors respectively. Starting at the front, the hood and hood supports on these, along with the sheet metal, is usually relatively robust. You're not really going to have too many issues with them, except for if you have the 430, you have probably, I think it's what, another 6 inches plus up here. I think anywhere from 6 inches to an extra foot of overhang here on the front, and your frame rails are extended, and your axle stays in place where it is. So does the rear axle. It's literally an extra foot of overhang. Simply for the 430 diesel. The diesel is quite a bit larger in length than this little Post Twin, and it has a coolant system, so you have to cram that somewhere inside that little engine bay in there. Most of the time, those front fins are made of very light steel. If you go and hit something, they're going to bend, so more than likely, it's going to get the shit beat out of it over time. You just peek your eye out, look for dents in there. Make sure it's nice and clean, no dents, anything like that, because it's a pretty good indicator of how hard they drove it whenever they were mowing or whatever they were doing with it. Same goes for up here in the corner with these nice old headlights and the front of the hood here. These love to absolutely break out, and especially if someone hits something hard enough. These are fiberglass. It'll just go right through it, which this one's seen a little bit of abuse, but it's nothing really to go home about. And the headlight lens is in pretty good shape, meaning that it probably hasn't sat outside for very long, or it hasn't been hit a whole bunch. So there you go, thumbs up to that. Like I said, side panels, they're pretty tough steel. It takes a good bit to bend them, and you can go find them a dime a dozen. Same with the hood if you got to replace them. 430s the same way. On the 420s with the Onins, they'll have a nice little indicator as to how hard they've been run, or if they've been not taken care of properly, because this will be a little bit faded in color towards the black side, like it's been heated up. If, like, say, the muffler's rotted off, or it's got an improper mix, or something's wrong with the engine, you're probably going to see it right there on that little tailpipe section. And in my case, this is nice and hot, or did get nice and hot at one point, because my muffler tip fell off when I first bought it, and it had run that way for a long time apparently. So, oh well, I had a spare muffler laying around that was new OEM, so I just chucked it on and called it good. But front axles on these, they're pretty. The axles themselves, spindles and bearings, they're all nice and tough, but the steering on these guys is kind of a different story, which I'll flip around to the other side here in a minute and go ahead and elaborate on that. But the frames on these are pretty tough. You usually won't ever see fractures, bends, or breaks, anything like that. You might get the occasional break down there where the mower deck mounts, but I've very rarely seen that. I've heard of it, but I've very rarely seen it. And of course, time to flip over to the other side, you'll come across a Mr. Power steering cylinder over here. This is fully hydrostatic power steering, all the way down to the power steering cylinder, up to the steering motor, all the way hydraulic compared to the 400 or just manual steering of the older tractors. It's pretty much a 318 supersized in this case, is what a 420 is. So if you notice a bunch of similarities, that's why. Although the power steering cylinder is lengthened right in here to accommodate for the 420, they do have a very bad case of breaking out right around here and right around here on this elbow and up on the frame. If your cylinder's not leaking, of course, these elbows like to go bad, like in this case this one is, and I'm gathering a bunch of junk on it from it. I got to do the O-rings in here, I think, and replace the elbows. That'll solve that problem. But other than that, these little cylinders are pretty robust. They actually can make, if you stick a good set of meats on these like this, they'll actually turn pretty good. So as for joints and wear out time, these joints down here, this ball joint down here likes to get worn out sometimes, and then of course your typical steering rod joints down here are just a little ball and socket type. They do tend to wear out pretty well too. My other 420, I've actually had 2 of these, and that other one was a great example of what not to look for, and this one is a great example of what to look for. So I kind of got an idea of what both was, and in this case, that tractor, my old one, was absolutely worn out. I could tighten all those bolts as much as I wanted to, and you could sit there and turn the steering wheel about half turn for you either made the wheels move. So yeah, definitely pay attention to that when you're going to buy one, because that's a really good indicator externally whether or not this thing's a piece of shit or not. And I mean that, because 420s and 430s are heavier, have bigger tires, and in the 430s case, it's got a diesel, so it's even more heavier yet. It's got that extra length on the front. and it's the same power steering cylinder all the way around. So you're going to find out pretty quick whether or not that's worn out or not. And same goes for the frame cracking. That'll tell you pretty well how hard it's been used. So we'll go ahead and open the hood as far as it'll go, of course, because it's jam-packed in here. In this case, I have the Onan P220G. It's a very good engine. It's pretty much an Onan P218G, which is basically what's in the late 316s and 318s from 1987 and up. Same goes for this one. They switched to the P220G from the B48E in 1987. Very good engines. It's electronic ignition, just slight upgrades from there, basically from the B series. Really, both engines you'll have, you won't lose with. They're pretty good engines if they've been taken care of. They're pretty good signs of whether or not it's been taken care of or not. You just have to start it and run to really figure that one out. There's quite a few problems that these do suffer from. It is a small engine after all. It can be a fickle engine in some cases. And in this case, the starters on these tend to go out, and it'll break the feet on the starter mounts, and then you got to go swap the oil pan and mounts out. It's a whole ordeal, but yeah, most of the time you won't incur it, but there's the rare occasion that you will. This one, I think, I take that back. I think it's that 316 that starts to have it, because you can hit the starter and it just sounds horrible. So it still spins it over, but it sounds horrible, like one of the mounts is broken and it's tweaked. So I'll have to dig into that, because I have the flyball governor spacer problem, which we'll get to that here in a minute, but that one has it pretty bad, so I got to yank the engine for it. Talking about that now, these engines are pretty bad if they have the plastic spacer in the governor for your little weights, your ball bearing weights to move in and out with your RPM. It's pretty much just a cone, and whenever that gets hot, those spacers tend to weld together and you lose function of your governor, or in this case, a symptom of it would be when you're at full throttle here and you're mowing and the engine just decides to randomly rev up, and then it stays up. Then you have to throttle it back, you throttle back more and more. Yeah, you got a flyball governor spacer problem. And that requires, sadly, to pull the engine, dig into the backside of the motor, put the steel spacer in there and replace that junk plastic one, put it all back together. And at that rate, while you're into it, you might as well take all the sheet metal off, blow it all off, get all that junk off of there that's accumulated over 30, 40, 50 years whenever the tractor is bought, of junk like that in there, because that will overheat it since it's an air-cooled engine. Probably not a bad idea to compression test it while it's out, check the heads, just do the valve adjustment, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on, but there's a good laundry list of things you can do if you ever have to pull one of these engines, but they're pretty easy to pull. I pulled the old engine out of that old 420, and it took me maybe an hour or two. It's not much harder than that 212 over there. As you can see, the engine's out of that one already, so they're a piece of cake. They're just a little air-cooled engine, and if you can't lift them, go have somebody else come help you, or get you a little cherry picker or something that can lift it up and out of there, because they're pretty light, so it's not the end-all be-all. Another discussion point that I actually probably missed on the 316, and if I didn't, then kudos to me, I guess, but in this case, as you can see, I have an electric fuel pump. Why is that? So these have pneumatically controlled fuel pump that usually sits right down there on the corner of the engine, and they're made of plastic for the nipples for your fuel lines, or in this case, the pulse line that goes from the crankcase into there to the fuel pump. They're made of plastic, and if you buy all the new ones, make sure you buy a new line. I've learned the hard way that I've gone through 3 pumps and replaced the lines 2 or 3 times now, and I finally just said, screw it, let's throw on an electric pump, and I wired it in to the key. Voila, now I have an electric pump that runs with the key, and I've solved all that problems with the junk fuel pumps in there, because those fuel pumps are nice and all when they're not been touched and they're working properly. Like, for example, that 316 still has his working fine. Hopefully, cross my fingers, knock on wood, if there was wood around here, that it doesn't quit, because they suck. That leads me to the next problem with these, which usually can occur back during a fuel tank. You have fuel pickups in there, whether it's for your main mode or your reserve mode. There's 2 modes on these. Back during a fuel tank, the fuel tank will get full of junk, or your pickup sock on the pickups will just completely plug, or something will happen with the pickups in the tank of some form, and they'll junk out on you, and you'll have a problem, which I did, where it'll sit there and starve for fuel, and you'll just have a bunch of issues that you don't want to go through. So more than likely, if you buy one of these own and powered tractors, or really just any of these old John Deeres in this styling anyways, you're more than likely going to want to set aside some time, come on tongue, to take this fender pan off, pull your fuel tank, clean it, and replace those steel pickups, because that is just preventive maintenance on these that really needs to be done. As much as we don't want to, they're a 40-plus-year-old tractor that needs attention. So I have noticed that the mufflers on these do tend to rot out, obviously from my statement earlier that I had to replace this one, but that's kind of a side factoid I just thought of right now. Not the end-all be-all, though. If your tractor does have this divider still intact in place, 90% of the time, this will just be a steel plate. You won't have any insulation, where in this case, you can see where there was adhesive here, where there should have been a probably half-inch thick piece of foam right here that goes all the way across the firewall. Those firewalls are there, so whenever you close the hood, I don't know if there's a mark in there. Yep, there you go. Right there, you can see where it sits down, it shuts, and it seals the engine compartment from the rest of the back of the forward compartment here. And whenever that foam's in place, it'll seal the hood, and it'll draw air from insides, up the bottom, up through, and out the front. Or vice versa. I can't remember the exact moment right now, but there is a path of travel that does this, and I can't remember what direction it is, but it is very crucial to have that piece of foam in there. It's very crucial to have your side panels. Most people don't think so, but yes, they're there for a reason. It's there to create a vacuum, I guess, since it's a restricted area here, and it helps create an induction and forces airflow. Grills, I guess, are not so important, but they're nice for filtration for sure, so definitely make sure that's there. And then, of course, the belly pans. These tractors have a belly pan. The 316, 318s have them. If they don't have them, that's usually a good sign that nobody's taking care of it. Same with the missing side panels. If there's no side panels, more than likely you might want to question how good the engine is. It's not going to be a direct indicator of whether or not the tractor's been beat to shit or not, but if your side panels and your belly pan are gone, you're more than likely going to want to question why, because that's not really a good thing. As for electrics, it's not the end-all, be-all. They're pretty good shape. Nothing really to worry about there. You get the occasional mouse that bites through them and ruins them, but other than that, they're pretty solid, pretty simple. Powder coating on these, while I'm thinking about it, the powder coat paint, you can see right there, just chips away if it's factory paint. Usually the wear spots will be right down here where your feet go, which actually this one's in really good shape. You get some going on up there at the top. Might get the couple peeling off here on the side, or on the back of the seat there, especially where it wears. But it's pretty easy to tell if you have a tractor from 1988 and later, 420 or 3 Series. They have this powder coat that peels off, and yeah, well, it starts rusting your fenders, so basically you got to repaint it. The fenders do it a little bit more often than the side panels or the hood support, and I think the side panels do it too, the back side panels, I mean, but they're not terrible about it. Wheels, I don't think I've ever really seen a problem with the newer paint jobs. I don't really ever see them rust out from the powder coat, and I don't think they are powder coating, honestly. I think it's just the green on the tractor. Same goes for the yellow on the mower deck, although this one's in really good shape and it's not really peeling, it's just worn out. The instrument cluster, if you still have white on the instrument cluster where there's raised lettering or symbols, it's not sat out in the sun usually, and it's in really good shape. That's a good indicator of where it's been all its life, whether it's been in a shed or outside. Same goes for decals, paint, etc., etc. That's the original seat. You usually get tears in these pretty often, but not too terribly. This one's been here since I bought it 2 or 3 years ago, and thankfully that's all it's been there. Oh, well, okay, it's starting to break out there, so that's going to eventually turn into that seat over there then. So that's disappointing. But regardless, you definitely want to look out because these seats will crack. And whether it's down here at the elbow where they ripple, or if you got a crack down here, up here, they'll find somewhere to crack on them. So, and that's about $150+ part, so keep that in mind. So the mower decks on these and just the entire drive system on this is pretty robust. It's shaft drive versus the 300 series belt drive. So you have a PTO clutch on the front of the engine, whether it's on the 420 or 430, that goes and drops from a set of belts down to a pulley, which then runs a shaft coming out of it to your gearbox on your mower deck, which then the shaft turns the input rotation to rotation this way, of course, and you now have a mower deck that functions. Those usually are relatively robust. You're more than likely going to chuck the belts on the mower deck or up front than you will anything, because they still have belts, just it eliminates the belt for the mule drive. These drive systems are really robust. You'll have a front PTO shaft because of that pulley that comes off the PTO there and goes down. You can run a snowblower, pretty much any front attachments off that. It is engine RPM speed though, so you can't run 2000 or 540 PTO attachments. Mower decks, 50 or 60 inch mower decks. Just make sure there's no junk like this sitting in it. And if your covers are missing, it's pretty easy to tell if it's rotted out or not. If you still have your covers, like I have the deck chute and the covers are, I think, upstairs in the loft. You might want to take them off and just make sure that nothing's rotted underneath. If you got any big holes or anything like that, more than likely you'll lose vacuum inside the mower deck, and you're probably going to want to go look for another mower deck shell. So definitely a good idea to inspect the mower deck if it comes with one, which most of the time they do, especially around the Midwest here where I'm from. My 99% of them all have mower decks. Although the 50-inch deck, like what's on a 300 series, is a little bit more rare on these than the 60-inch here. It's pretty easy to tell if it's a 50 or 60. Just look to the side, see if you got the wheels come off to support it like that. It's really big and beefy. You can't miss it. These front dolly wheels are also big and beefy. And a really big indicator to me is instead of one even shell and thickness all the way around with a 50-inch, this one kind of slopes down and back. And, of course, it pokes out from past your tires even in the widest stance. So you definitely know it's a 60. These are the nicest cutting decks I think I've ever come across, though. Hands down, out of anything new today, well, maybe except for a really professional, like, say, a new John Deere zero-turn that's for a professional landscaping business, maybe that one will cut as good. But this mower deck, just to me, in opinion, will outcut a zero-turn, will outcut the 50-inch deck, 46, any of that. This thing is where it's at. It's just high maintenance and they're expensive. So when you come back down here on the frames, these axle tubes for the 420s and 430s are substantially longer. They do like to break out down there where they mount on the bottom. I have broken ears off on the old 420 I have, and that's a very common occurrence with these, whether it's either tractor. They will get so much torque on here, and just with the big frame and all that good torquing and torsion and whatever else have you, they'll just snap. So usually one or two of the bolt holes will have a nice hairline fracture or a decent sized fracture. And that's definitely a point you want to look at. Get down in there, hop underneath the axle, look up in there and see if there's any cracking, because that usually means if this tractor's been taking over really mean territory, or if it's been a dirt mover. Like I've thrown to the front blade on this and pushed dirt with it, but it's still not cracked though. You come back here, you had the option for a rear PTO. Those are extremely rare, too relatively rare. They're most certainly not uncommon. Usually, if you had a tractor that had rear PTO, this guy over here would be open with a second switch right there. And those are a really handy thing to have. I honestly might go and buy a setup for this one and wire it in, because this one's already got a 3-point, which this is a factory OEM John Deere 3-point. I like these quite a bit. They're a little category 0, and I think they might be a category 1 if you have to change out the arms, but I would stick with 0. You're really limited with category 1 because of your lift, and it's so cramped and small that it's just not worth fiddle-dee-deeing around with ones. Drawbars on these, I think, do have a tendency to crack out up there on the frame as well on these, but they're nowhere near as often as on the axles there. They're pretty tough. I mean, you can put as much weight as you want behind it if you feel safe to do so. I don't recommend doing it. Don't take that for my word, but you could probably put a fishing boat or something on the back of it with a ball hitch, and you'd probably be fine. I just wouldn't recommend it, though. That's how relatively robust these things are. You do get the occasional time where you'll see a crack on the lug up here, back here on these wheels, but that's not very often. And speaking of front wheels, I don't really ever have a problem with these ones, honestly. These are pretty tough all the way around when it comes to the 3 Series or 4 Series. The front wheels have always been pretty robust. So, and of course, going to the very back here with your transaxle, you'll have, if it's a 420 or 430, you'll be the 2-speed transaxle It's a hydrostack control. That's that big red lever on the right side there. These things are tanks. For a hydro, they're tanks. Especially with that 2-speed, you throw them down in low gear and it'll pretty much do what you ask of it. It'll spin the tires before it'll stop the tractor kind of thing. You do still need regular maintenance intervals. It does have a filter on the transaxle, so it wouldn't hurt if you can, because the belly pans will get in the way. But if you can see that filter at all, see if it's new or not, I doubt you will. Come down here and check your sight glass tube level, which I need to fill mine. It should be within this range here, whether it's with red ATF or if it's with high guard. It honestly does not matter. It is the fluid of your choice. I would recommend hydraulic fluid personally because there's not as harsh additives in there as there is in ATF for the transmissions for friction material, but that's just my opinion. I've heard of people running ATF all the time, and I don't think I've heard of many problems happening with them. For example, that 316 over there actually had ATF in it before I drained it and put hydraulic or high guard in it, and no new leaks and nothing strange. It's acted the same since. So you can do either or. It's your choice, but I would lean towards a little bit more of the hydraulic side simply because of the additives. Most of the time, these will be still in here. I somehow managed to bust that side out, so I got to go get a new one and put a new tail light in, though. I can't remember. Did I put LEDs in this one? No, they're still incandescent. But those will bust out. Mower deck chute, of course, will break off every now and then. You do have a diff lock for the rear differential. They do work splendidly when they do. I've never really heard of them breaking. Real tough units. For the brakes, pretty much just make sure they're adjusted, make sure it all works, and doesn't bind up. When you press it, take the lock, put it down, make sure it locks. You shouldn't be able to move the hydro lever up or down. If it's locked like it is now, that's a really good sign as to whether or not that hydro linkage is in good shape and not loose. These do tend to creep a lot. These do tend to creep a lot whenever the older generations, I think there's 3 or 4 generations of iterations for this hydraulic linkage that goes back to the swash plate to control your movement from that lever. And this is the latest one, since this is a 90 or 91. And truth be told, I like this one better. This is probably the most solid. There's, I think, one adjustment there, and that's it. There's turnbuckle on the old one somewhere down there, and on the second generation, you got to do something underneath that dash panel. It's just stuff like that. But I like this newest rendition of it the most because it's the most solid. There's not very many problems that can occur. I've got 1,400 hours on this, and it's still tight as Tick's ass. The only downside to this setup, though, is that it can be noisy. I'm not entirely sure why. My old 420 was a little bit the same way, but this one's the most noisy out of all of them I've had. If you go to move forward or backwards at a lower idle or just even high RPM, you can hear the pump really bad chatter because the vibration goes through all that linkage and it's real nice and tight, and you can actually hear it a lot worse. So that's just what I've experienced, but they're really great design, but they're a little bit louder for some reason. I'll never understand why to this day, but it's just the way she goes. So there are various body changes over the years, as for example, the implementation of this being inside of the actual side panel on the early models. On the later ones, they're removable like this, and I believe that's for both sides. You have flip-up seats from 88 and later, if I remember correctly. I'm probably very wrong on that. You can get a suspension seat for them. Those are absolutely kick-ass. They're wonderful. But this one, actually, I find quite comfy, especially if it's got that spring there. You have a second spring and your regular torsion spring of that bar there. So, I don't mind them. The very early 420s had a different style of wheel. Those were, I think, less prone to cracking, but they still are a garden tractor wheel, so definitely don't disregard that, although they don't really crack very often. For a first appearance, if you're going to go look at it, the first thing I look for basically on these is I look at the instrument panel to see if it's whether or not it's got white paint on it still. Could always have been repainted, but still means that someone's taking care of it if they repainted it. I look at my pedal wear. If my brakes are flat or if there's no ridges on them, like you can see there's ridges on them down there. If they still have ridges, it's probably not been used very often. If tires are in good shape, not dry rotted, holding air. Look along the frame rail for leaks like you'd see right there. I got an oil stain, but that's from me changing oil and I never cleaned it. Look at the mower deck. If you can see paint missing or rust, or if you don't see covers or just more stuff like that, more than likely you might want to take a side of caution on that. Missing lights, it means it'll been beat up. Seat's rough. No one took care of it and didn't replace stuff. That's a good sign. Like I said, power steering cylinder, it's a really easy appearance to look at. If they haven't fixed it, it'll probably be leaking like a sieve. Same goes for the lift cylinder back here. You have a lift cylinder for your 3-point. It's tucked up, back up underneath here. There he is right there. Check for him to leak too. Check for lever looseness. These really like to wear out quite often. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and share it to somebody else who's about ready to buy one. If you know somebody, if not, thanks for watching for your enjoyment.